Well, the threat of a snap election is over after the federal budget passed the last of 3 confidence votes last night with the support of the NDP. So electoral politics takes a backseat to the pandemic, at least for now. But Canadians do still have opinions about the way their leaders are, well, leading. David Coletto is the CEO of Abacus Data. He's with me now. David, good to see you again. Hope all is well as you, push through the pandemic like so many other Canadians. We'll get to the latest results in a moment. But first, what do we need to know about this survey?
So we completed this survey earlier this week. We interviewed just over 2,200 Canadians, representative sample, weighted according to the census by age, region, gender, official language, and educational attainment, and it was conducted online.
Okay, so look, we have the ongoing pandemic response. We have a new federal budget. There won't be a snap spring election now, but if at least not soon. But if we were headed to the polls now, how would Canadians vote?
Well, we continue to see that the Liberals have a sizable lead over the Conservatives. In our most recent survey, we have the Liberals ahead by 7 points, 36% for them, 29% for the Conservatives, the NDP at 17%, and both the Bloc and the Green Party at 7%. And when we compare that to our trend line, this is a slight dip for the Liberals. They're down 3 points from last week before the federal budget. But you can see there, this is the 4th poll in a row that shows the Liberals with a pretty sizable lead, a healthy enough lead that if these numbers were to hold on election day, that they would be pretty close, if not over the line of winning a majority government again.
All right, tell me about the impressions that voters have of the federal leaders. Who's impressing them and who's impressing them not so much?
Yeah, well, Mr. Trudeau, the Prime Minister, for a long time has been a pretty polarizing figure. You've got a sizable number, 37%, who say they've got a favorable view of him compared to 42% who have a negative view. For Mr. O'Toole, the opposition leader, a little different story. Only 1 out of 5 have a positive view of the Conservative leader compared to 34% negative. Mr. Singh, the New Democrat leader, is actually, if we look at a net positive, he's the most popular leader. More people view him positively than negatively. And for Ms. Paul, the Green Party leader, she's still largely unknown. About equal numbers have a positive and negative view, but you can see the bulk of Canadians fall in the middle. They either say they don't have much impression of her or they don't know her at all.
Let's drill down a bit on the Prime Minister and the leader of the official opposition, Erin O'Toole, over the past number of months. When you look at where their impressions have been with Canadians, what do you see?
Well, for the Prime Minister, I think, if you look at the chart, his numbers have remained fairly static over the last number of months. There was a period early on in the pandemic where his positives really went up, but they've come back more to normal where we have about equal numbers viewing him positively and negatively. Now, that's not the case for Mr. O'Toole. It appears the more people get to know the Conservative Party leader, the more they dislike him. You can see that red line continuing to rise, whereas that green line is holding fairly steady. And that's, I think, a real challenge for Mr. O'Toole in that not only is he starting off relatively unknown when he was elected leader last year, but since that time, he hasn't really gained much traction with Canadians and finds himself having the most negative view of any leader in terms of net favorability.
You also asked which of the party leaders would be preferred as the Prime Minister. What did Canadians tell you there?
We found that the Prime Minister himself, which is often the case when we ask this kind of question, has a sizable lead. He's at 31%. Mr. O'Toole is actually in a close race with Mr. Singh, 18% for the Conservative leader, 17% for Mr. Singh. But I do point your attention to that big gray bar there, right. The 28% of Canadians who say they're not sure who they would prefer to be PM after the next election. So advantage Mr. Trudeau, but still lots of Canadians out there not sure. And I think that's a reflection of the fact, first, that Mr. O'Toole is still relatively unknown. And two, because we're in the middle of a pandemic, and I think this is important to note, not a lot of people are really thinking about that choice right now until they're actually forced to if we have an election later this spring or in the fall.
Fair enough. And what about if you narrow it down to just Justin Trudeau versus Erin O'Toole? What do you see?
Well, here we see, again, another advantage for the Prime Minister. 60% of Canadians, if forced to choose, who do they want to be Prime Minister? 60% choose the Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister, 40% for Mr. O'Toole. And when we look at it across current party supporters, not surprising, most Liberals want Mr. Trudeau, most Conservatives want Mr. O'Toole. But this is where, if we're going to see some consolidation among New Democrats, among Green Party supporters, even among Bloc supporters, a majority in all three cases would prefer the Prime Minister. And among undecided voters, almost 2/3 say they'd prefer the Prime Minister over Mr. O'Toole. And so all of that suggests that if we do get into an election where it's a close two-way race between the Conservatives and the Liberals, this bodes well for the Prime Minister and able to perhaps bring some of those other party voters onto his side.
You also asked about the desire for change, which is an important driver for voters, especially if it looks like we're going to have an election. Often that's what decides it. People say, look, it's ready for change. If we're going to have a change of government, rather, this is where you start to see that number. What are they saying now?
Well, we actually find right now, and we've seen this for the last few months since we've been tracking it, that the desire for change, the intensity to kick out the incumbents isn't as strong today as it was at the beginning or the end of the last federal election. At that time, more than half of the country said, we definitely want a change in government. Give us anybody else other than Mr. Trudeau. Today, that number is only 39%. Now, there are far more people who say I'd prefer a change in government than keeping the current one. But that most important groups are those in the middle, those who say, I'd like change, but it's not important, or I'd like to keep the Liberals, but it's not that important. Among those two groups, the Liberals have a big lead, and that's why they're able to build this national lead over the Conservatives. That desire for change, which drove voters to both the Conservatives, the New Democrats, the Greens, the Bloc in the last election, it's not there. And so that's going to be a key indicator that will guide and really point to whether the Liberals are really in trouble or whether they're much more safe in terms of their re-election.
And let's finish on one more graphic, and that's the performance of some key provincial premiers trying to manage this third wave of the pandemic. What are you finding?
We've seen, and these are the four largest provinces where we have large enough sample sizes. And as you can see here, there are two premiers that are doing quite well, Mr. Legault in Quebec, Mr. Horgan in British Columbia. Both of them have far more people who say they have a favorable or positive view of them than negative. And then you've got Mr. Ford in Ontario and Mr. Kenney in Alberta, where over the last number of months, we've seen their negatives continue to rise. In particular, for Mr. Ford in Ontario, for most of 2020 and into 2021, we'd actually seen more people say they like him than dislike him. It's only in the last few weeks that we've seen his negatives rise, and I think that comes on the heels of that press conference and the new restrictions that he put in place a few weeks ago. That really rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, and he now faces numbers much more similar to what we saw before the pandemic for the Premier in Ontario than we see today. Now, this is going to be obviously important. They're key players in the political realm, but we see two very different worlds when it comes to how Canadians in different provinces are reacting to the decisions and the performance of their premiers.
All right, lots to consider there, David Coletto. Thanks again for your time today. Appreciate it. We'll talk soon.
Always a pleasure, Peter. Thanks.